Americans fit into the political process. Louisiana Representative Charles Boustany, one of 3 Arab Americans in the U.S. House, joins state and local representatives of Arab descent. This is just under an hour.
Because the microphones are actually quite sensitive. My name is Maya Berry. I have the privilege of being from Dearborn, Michigan, so as a Dearbornite, I welcome everyone here. I also have the privilege of having spent 7 years at the Arab American Institute, so this is all like my turf, and I'm just thrilled to be here in that regard. Our panel today is examining our role in the political parties, Republicans and Democrats. I want to just say briefly that I'm going to be very quick in my introductions of our speakers because the focus of our discussion is really for us to have a discussion, and that'll include at the end questions and answers from our audience. We are thrilled today that we have the privilege of opening up our panel by hearing from Congressman Charles Boustany. He's a Republican that represents the 7th District of Louisiana, and I will turn it over to him to get started.
Thank you very much, Maya. It's a real privilege to be here today. I was listening to the last panel, and I'm aware of the numbers and the approval rating of Congress, and John mentioned the 11% approval rating. So I suppose my presence here today is a testament to either my foolhardiness or my courage. But I'm going to ask John Zogby not to poll that question. I want to start and just talk a little bit about how I got involved, because I think it's a good introduction to the topic that we're going to discuss today. You know, after 12 years of intense training to become a heart surgeon after college, I started a medical practice, heart surgery practice in Louisiana in 1990. And readily and quickly became aware of the healthcare problems out there from a policy standpoint. I got involved in my community, and I've had lifelong interest in history and foreign policy and all these other things. And through civic involvement, I gradually gravitated to a decision that I wanted to run for Congress, which I remember making that decision distinctly in late in 2003. I think it was sometime in early December. And I remember reading a newspaper early that morning. And on the front page of the paper, it was a statewide newspaper circulated throughout Louisiana, there was discussion of 2 young men, a Marine and a soldier, who had died in Iraq, both of whom had gone to school with my son in the same high school. And then I also noticed that Louisiana had the worst roads in the United States, yet we were supplying a lot of the oil and gas infrastructure and energy for the rest of the country. We had the highest poverty rate in the United States. We had the worst healthcare outcomes in the United States, despite the highest per capita spending through our public hospital system. And then there was an article about out-migration, some of our best and brightest graduating from college and leaving the state to find opportunities. And I remember thinking very clearly that morning that the common denominator in this is leadership, political leadership for the state, because we have a great state, wonderful attributes and assets, and yet why are we last on all these lists? And it's right then and there that I made the decision that I was going to run for Congress in the 2004 election. And I had one big hurdle first off, and it was to get my wife to support me in this, because she always swore that she would divorce me if I ever ran for political office. And we had a very heated discussion that started that morning and lasted about 3 days. And finally, she agreed to let me run, but she said, "You have one shot." And so I knew this was high stakes. And so I went to work, and lo and behold, 12 months later, I got elected to Congress through a lot of hard work. But I'll never forget, in the August before the election, I was at 4% in the polls. And I had some of the press were asking me, "Well, what are you going to do? I mean, at 4%, how are you going to win this? You're running against 2 very prominent state senators." And I thought about it for a moment, and I said, 4%. I didn't know my family was that big, nor did I realize I'd operated on that many people in the state. But we went on subsequently to win with 55% of the vote through a lot of hard work, grassroots activity, raising the money and doing all those things, the mechanics of running a campaign. But also, I won because of a couple of other things. One, I listened to people from all walks of life in the district and took to heart what they had to say about what was wrong and incorporated that into a plan that I called my prescription for prosperity. And the second thing I did was I never let anybody go by without shaking their hand, asking them for their vote, and thanking them. And I approached everyone. In fact, I remember approaching this one a little Cajun French guy, and I was told by two other people standing nearby that he was a yellow dog liberal Democrat, and he had never, ever voted for a Republican in his life. So I said, well, watch this. I walked over to him and I said, hey, I heard you never vote for Republicans. He said, that's right, I'm a Democrat. I've never voted for a Republican. So I challenged him. I said, well, you're stupid. And of course, broke all the rules for a candidate to confront somebody like that. And he says, what you mean, man? He puffed up and looked at me like, he wanted to fight with me or something. And I said, no, you're stupid because you're telling me that you don't consider the issues. You just go and hit the party label. And he said, well, you have a point. And I kept working on this guy and many others throughout my district because it's a 56% Democratic registration district. And I won with 55%, as I mentioned before, but that guy 3 months later was at a small fundraiser for me. So I convinced him to support me. So I guess the lesson there is to never give up, pursue everyone's vote, and ask for their help, and listen. Listen, not preach, but listen. But I want to talk, getting back to the whole purpose of this, I want to talk a little bit about two things. One, my awakening in this process, which is interesting, and then this journey that I've discovered and that I've embarked on. First, the awakening. Growing up in Lafayette, Louisiana, in southwest Louisiana, I grew up in a close-knit Lebanese-American family, but I really didn't have much awareness about the greater Arab-American community in this country, this rich cultural environment that we have in this country. And it wasn't until I actually stepped out into the arena to offer myself as a candidate for Congress that I began to discover this great and wonderful community. And it has just been a truly amazing experience. And I know my grandfather, who was a Lebanese immigrant, would be proud to see me here today speaking to all of you. But this awakening is something that is very personal, because while I represent a constituency in southwest Louisiana, I also see it as a very important role for me to represent the Arab American population in this country. That's a very important constituency. And regardless of where you are on the political spectrum, I take that charge very, very, very seriously and want to hear all the views and will entertain them. And I'm not so arrogant as to know that I have a lot to learn. And I want to understand the viewpoints and do the best that I can to represent those viewpoints in Congress and before this administration and future administrations. And that's the journey, because I can tell you I had another episode one night when Lebanon was being bombed, and I was very distraught about this because there was a deafening silence coming out of Washington. And I remember thinking that there's a lot I don't know about all this, and there's a lot I need to learn. And so I've embarked on this educational process, which is not only taking me into reading extensively books, papers, and other things, but bringing in experts to talk and discuss from all sides of the spectrum, and also the travel to really try to understand these issues that we're confronted with in the Middle East. And that's the journey I've embarked on, and I know there's a long journey before me, and that's why I'm going to want your help to help guide me in this journey as we go forward, because it's critical. Because the issues facing this country today are so linked to what all of us as Arab Americans consider extremely important. And so we have a huge role to play. And it's important that we play a role in both parties, because if we limit ourselves to one party and one view, we're not going to be very effective. We can influence this political process much more profoundly by influencing both parties. And I like to joke, people ask, I was the first Republican in my family, and I registered as a Republican when I registered to vote in the mid-'70s. And I did it, I believed in Ronald Reagan and strong national defense, keeping government as small as possible, but effective and competent. And those were the principles I believed in at that time. And I've remained a Republican. But I can tell you, I don't always agree with what my party's doing. So I often tell people I come from the Boustany wing of the Republican Party. And, I guess that illustrates that I like to believe that I will think independently and do the proper study and homework on these issues. So I'm going to close so we can get to right down to questions, but we need to drive policy from both sides. We need to dare greatly. And I also live by this one quote. It's a great scientist, Louis Pasteur, who said, "Chance favors the prepared mind." Now, I know we all have our minds prepared, and we all need to figure out what is going to be the level of our involvement in the political process, whether it's running for office or being in, or at whatever level, local level, state level, federal level. Is it raising money for candidates? Is it being a part of the political party structure? But we need to be involved. All of us need to find that level of involvement where we're comfortable in both parties and drive policy. And so with that, I'm going to end, and then we'll start with questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Congressman Boustany. For those of you that don't know him, one of the Congresspeople have a very difficult job between their travel schedules, between the schedules that's being maintained on the Hill now, committee assignments and all of that. You really can take pride in that he works incredibly hard on both his constituent work and the work of the broader U.S. Congress and the role that it should be playing in the world, and we're very grateful for that. Moving on, we're going to have 4 presenters with us. They're going to speak briefly for a few moments. They're going to focus on questions relating to our role in the political parties. Keeping in mind, neither party is perfect. We all know that. Therefore, why bother joining a party? Are the principles that first attracted you to becoming a Republican or a Democrat applicable today? What concerns do you have as an Arab American in your party, as opposed to one who approaches this without a particular ethnic identity? So there's a variety of things we want to talk about. We want to sort of start with those discussion points, and we'll begin with Eddie Ayoob, who is a former counsel and foreign affairs advisor to Senate Majority Leader Harry Reid. Eddie?
Thanks, Maya. And in the interest of keeping the introductions brief, I thought I'd focus on those parts of my background that would relate to some of the questions and topics that we would discuss today. Is that on? Okay. As Maya mentioned, I worked for Senator Harry Reid of Nevada. I'm actually from Las Vegas. I was his foreign affairs advisor at the time that I was with him. And what drove me in terms of what was, if I had an underlying theme that I tried to relate to my boss, to my colleagues, was you didn't have to be anti-Arab to be pro-Israel. And I think within the Democratic Party, it's just a fact. It's a reality that, and not just the Democratic Party, but that my boss in particular was very pro-Israel, and he was not shy about it. He was proud of it. And a lot of members are happy to be pro-Israel, and I think that's fine. I mean, it's just that my point that I tried to make to my colleagues and my boss was that you can be pro-Israel and you can be pro-Arab, and you certainly don't have to be anti-Arab to be pro-Israel. And a little bit of background on myself, again, and I think this will come out as we deal with some of these questions. First of all, why we choose to be a Democrat or a Republican. I think Charles touched on that a little bit. I get my politics from my mother, who's actually the non-Arab American. My father's the Lebanese American. My mother is 5th generation German American, came in 1804, I think, or 1808, something like that. But came from a strong union blue-collar family in western Pennsylvania. And so that's really where I get my politics. I'm not a Democrat because of the Middle East. I'm a Democrat because my mom and my family had this very pro-union, pro-working class family background. So that's really where I draw my Democratic credentials. And then even on the Lebanese side, my father's family came here in 1888. So I'm different from a lot of the newer arrivals. And I think one thing about the Arab American community is the same as the American community as a whole. We're different. I mean, we have Christians and Muslims, Sunnis and Shias, religious, non-religious, political, apolitical. And like I came from a half Lebanese, half German, Polish family. We grew up in Las Vegas. There was no Maronite church, so I went to the Roman Catholic church, went to Roman Catholic grade school, Roman Catholic high school. It wasn't until I got to Pittsburgh, where I went to undergrad and law school, that I actually was able to be part of a broader community. So these are things that, broader Arab American community, I should say. So these are things that structured or influenced my background and how I brought that background to a political career in Washington. And then finally, I would add, and then we can get on to any particular question that you have, is that as important as the Middle East is to me, and especially with what happened in Lebanon in the past couple years, I'm unequivocal about the fact that I'm an American first and I am a Lebanese or Arab American second. And it doesn't mean that I don't love my heritage. I love my heritage. I love my background. I had the tears in my eyes when I visited my grandfather's village the first time I was there. But I am emphatic about the fact that I'm an American first, and I approach everything that I ever did in Congress, working for a member of Congress, or everything that I approach, whether it's in this capacity, is the fact that I'm an American first. And I know that's different for some people who are maybe newer arrivals, and I was born in this country, and others who might be in this audience were not. But again, I think that shows the beauty of our community is that we're just like any other American. We have these differences, and I think that's to the benefit of our community.
Thank you very much, Eddie. Next, we'll hear from David Cappiello, who is the Connecticut State Senator and is hoping to be joining Congressman Charles Boustany soon, as he's a candidate for the 5th Congressional District in Connecticut. David.
Thank you. Can you all hear me right now? Again, my name is David Cappiello. I come from Danbury, Connecticut, formerly the Hat City of the world. And some of you may ask yourself about the name Cappiello. It doesn't really sound Lebanese or Arab American, but my mother, her maiden name is Safi, and my grandmother was a Habib. So I assure you I am very Lebanese. And growing up in Danbury, we have a very strong Lebanese community, and my grandfather, Jiddu Kamil Safi, had a radio show on a local radio station for 25 years called the Lebanon American Hour. And we were talking about, when the congressman was talking about one time not fully understanding the meaning of the community, being an Arab or Lebanese American, I remember having to listen to the radio show every Sunday morning with my mother and father, wondering why I couldn't be watching cartoons. And now I've recently asked my grandmother, Sithu, who's my only living grandparent, for some of those tapes, and I listened to the old tapes and remember fondly those Sunday mornings. I do want to say to Congressman Boustany, you've given me a great idea for a targeted mailer to the Democrats. I thought I could send him a mailer saying, "You're stupid. Call me and I'll tell you why." Now,
I don't recommend that.
Well, I'll start with my wife because she's a registered Democrat, lifelong Democrat. I met her at the state capitol many years ago, and often people have said to us, "You remind us of James Carville and Mary Matlin," and I always reassure them that that's not the case. I'm more like Arnold Schwarzenegger, clearly, physically and looks-wise, and she's more like Maria Shriver. But we have two beautiful boys. One is a little over 2 years old, Jack Reagan. That was a negotiation itself, the name. And latest, our 4-month-old Jude Francis. Why I had got involved in politics, or why I became a Republican. I became a Republican, frankly, like many other Republicans, because growing up, watching the first debate in 1980 with my father, with Jimmy Carter, President Jimmy Carter, and Governor Ronald Reagan, and I knew that I wanted to be of the party of Ronald Reagan, not only because I believed in most of what he believed in, but I believed that he believed what he was saying. And I think sometimes we think, and rightfully so, that many of our leaders don't always believe what they say. They believe what they think you want to hear. And that's why I think that Ronald Reagan was one of our greatest leaders ever in this country. And how I got involved in politics, myself, when I was in college, I had done an internship at the state capitol in Hartford, Connecticut, and was fascinated by the process, fascinated by how things work. Started to work there for a few years. And then when Connecticut was going through some very difficult times, we had recently had tough economic times, an income tax was implemented, and I believe that there needed to be some change in Connecticut to turn things around. And I haven't looked back since. So I'm looking forward to today's debate, and I want to thank the Arab American Institute, along with C-SPAN, for putting this together.
Thank you, David. Next, we'll hear from Denno, who's the Chief of Staff to Michigan State Representative, Michigan State Senator Buzz Thomas. Don't want to make that mistake. But Dennis is also the former Communications Director for the Michigan State Party, so he brings a great deal of grassroots experience to this as well. Dennis?
Thank you to AI for inviting me. And as Maya said, I'm Chief of Staff for Democratic State Senator Buzz Thomas. He's actually the Democratic floor leader in the Michigan Senate, and I was a communications director for the Michigan Democratic Party. I also have my own polling firm, so watch out, John Zogby, right? Seriously, though, Congressman Boustany said that he got involved because he saw a lack of leadership in his state and in his community. And I got involved because my parents told me not to. But I think that's an important point. My parents told me not to get involved, and that's a big frustration I see with our community, is that not enough of us get involved, especially on the state and the local political level. It's not that there's obstacles put in our way as a community. It's that I don't see enough of us getting involved in journalism, getting involved in political science, talking to our elected officials. We currently have more staff, Arab American staff, in the Michigan legislature than I can remember, and I've been working in Michigan politics for about 15 years, and it's really exciting. Some of our major lobbyists in Lansing are Arab Americans. Unfortunately, we only have one Arab American elected official in Lansing, Barb Farah, State Representative Barb Farah, who's term limited. But we really need to become more active so that we can have more people from our community represented. And I don't care if it's in Lansing, I don't care if it's in Dearborn or Detroit or whatever city or community you're from. And part of the way to get involved is to go to meetings, get involved in campaigns, whether it's going door to door, whether it's getting involved in phone banks or whatever. When there are local elections, your local candidates need as much volunteer help as possible. And that's a way to get your foot in the door, to get your opinions in the door, and to let elected officials and candidates know that we are Arab Americans, we are out there, we are real, and to get our voices and our opinions heard. That's about it. Thank you.
Thank you, Dennis. Next, we will hear from Randa Fahmy Hudome. Randa is a former Associate Deputy Secretary of Energy and, of course, spent some years on the Hill working for our Senator from Michigan, former Senator Spencer Abraham. Randa?
Great. Thank you, Maya. Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here today. I know many of you in the audience from certainly years of political activity, so I'm so glad to see the large group that are gathered here today. We've been asked to talk a little bit about our role in the political party. Of course, I would call somewhat of a unique experience in meshing my Arab American political activity with my activity in the political party, the Republican Party, that is. The roots of why I became a Republican are probably no different from what Eddie or anyone else on the panel talked about, which is it comes from familial ties. My parents, both immigrants to this country, my father from Egypt and my mother from Iran, came here in the 1950s with a strong belief in social, cultural values, conservatism, both economic and social. My dad was a very strong advocate of federalism, where the states control a lot of the decisions being made. He and my mother also believed in coming here like every other immigrant did, working hard and becoming what they were and educating their family without the help of the federal government. And that became, I think, very ingrained in me as a child. While I grew up in the 60s and 70s, very, very impressed, I would say, by the political process here in the United States, whether that was as a child watching the Watergate hearings or every 4 years tuning into the conventions, whether they were Republican or Democrat conventions. I decided at an early age when I was in high school that I was going to law school, that I was going to try and mix my political interest with the law. And I certainly did that, but I came of age, like many Republicans of my era, with Ronald Reagan. I think it's no big surprise that people are invoking his name continuously today, because he very much had an impact on those of us who were young Republicans at the time and wanted to get involved and had a bright view of our country and the future. We were also coming off of malaise of Jimmy Carter in the 70s, and of course a very particular interest of mine was the situation in Iran, and everybody's feeling that he had made a mess of that. I progressed through my party, I would say, by doing two things. One, becoming an activist in the Arab American community. As many of you know, I was a lobbyist for the National Association of Arab Americans in the early 90s, and I felt no problem whatsoever seamlessly intertwining, I would say, my activity in the Arab American community with the Republican Party. I went to the Republican convention in 1992 as an Arab American representative. I worked on behalf of H.W. Bush, President Bush at the time. And so it was what I would call the good years, certainly, in the Republican Party. Since then, as many of you know, I came to Michigan and worked with many of you here in the audience to elect the first Arab American senator from the state of Michigan. It was certainly unprecedented what we did then, which was rally both the support of the Republican and Democratic Arab American community to support one candidate. What I'd like to say today, which I think is important because I know the media is covering it, the Arab American community is not monolithic. We are not Republicans or Democrats. You cannot stand in the middle of the room and say, well, all Arab Americans are Republicans or all Arab Americans are Democrats. They are not. Proof positive is looking at the polls and the election results throughout the years of where Arab Americans have voted. It's not only great pollsters like John Zogby who do that, but you can definitely temper what the Arab American vote went like, for instance, in the year 2000, where 79% of Arab and Muslim Americans voted for Spencer Abraham and George W. Bush in Michigan. It is fact. You can go into the school districts in Dearborn, in Hamtramck, in Bloomfield Hills, and in Southfield, where there is a high concentration of Arab Americans, and you can see what the facts are. One of the reasons I believe that many of the Republican candidates did not show up at the conference today, nor did they send surrogates, is because some political hack in Washington probably told them, ignore Michigan, ignore the Arab American community, they're a bunch of Democrats anyway. They're all going to vote Democrat. That is not true. I believe that our community can rationally assess the situation, take a look at the candidates, listen to their positions as they are, and make a decision on who they're going to vote. But you cannot make your decision on who you're going to vote if you can't see the candidates and hear what they have to say themselves. I'll just end by saying, there's probably many of you out there, like myself, who belong to the club. We're called the doctors, disaffected Republicans. We are not happy with the candidates who are running for president. We are not happy with the domestic and foreign policy decisions that are being made by our party. But what I've certainly come to conclude is that these are individuals within our party. These are people and personalities. They are not the heart root of the Republican Party. They are a small minority that have led our party astray. And there's nobody more than me that has been challenged to whether or not I continue to stay in my party. And I experienced it this week, where I was invited to a breakfast with Laura Bush before she launched her Middle East program to raise awareness on breast cancer. And I thought it was fabulous that the First Lady was going to Saudi Arabia and Kuwait and other places in the Middle East to raise awareness on breast cancer research. And I was so proud to be a Republican. And the next day I was invited to the National Democratic Institute, where Madeleine Albright, Nancy Pelosi, and others stood on the podium and talked about democracy in the world and awarded a prize to the president of Liberia, Ellen Johnson Sirleaf. And so I feel this tug every day, nobody more so because I'm in Washington. But what I've decided to do, and what I think it's important for everyone to do, is to stay within your political parties and fight. Make your voices known, and that's something that I hope to continue to do in Washington. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Randa. We're going to go ahead and begin our discussion now. And before we go to Q&A from the audience, I just wanted to take one step back, because I know this is a discussion that we've had among ourselves as a community. One of the questions being party politics itself. Is it a means to an end? Why? There are people, for the reasons you've cited, Randa, and some that I'm sure will come up in our discussions as Democrats as well, that have genuine concerns about being involved in a particular party. That is, they still want to hold on to this idea that they can work in politics, drive their issue agenda forward without necessarily having to choose one of the two. And if I can have some of you perhaps address that point first.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I'll take it. Oftentimes, policies are shaped within political parties. Whether it's right now, where are the policies being shaped for the next president of the United States? Within advisors to the presidential campaign, and eventually within the party platforms that you will see launched at the Republican and the Democratic convention. So I don't see how you can push agenda ahead without being on the inside. And right now, the inside really is the two choices of the parties, Republicans and Democrats. I know some have joined the Libertarian Party and other what I would call third parties, but I think the real action action is within those parties, and you cannot get your issues across without being inside one of those parties and being active.
If I could, I would like to agree completely. Being a state senator for many years, I look to a number of people that are around me at all times for advice. I'm not a typical Republican on many issues, and I think that's because I'm willing to listen to other people who have differing points of view than I do. And I think one of the main problems right now that we see between both parties, particularly in Washington, is that it seems to be that some elected officials do not want to hear anyone of the opposing view, and therefore it's tough for the two sides to come together. If you don't get involved with either party, if you don't help on campaigns, if you don't decide to make your voice heard, not just yell at someone, not just call them up and say, you're upset with this vote or that vote, but get involved in their campaign or their opponent's campaign and let your voice be heard. Because the only way we are going to make a change on Middle Eastern issues or any of our issues here in America is if we decide to stand up, let our voices be heard, but get involved so people know there are ramifications by ignoring the Arab American community.
Go ahead, Eddie.
And I would, of course, agree with the last two statements. I would just add a couple nuances to that. One, to pick up what Randa was talking about staying within your political party, is that whether you're an elected official or a staffer or anybody else, your best position when you are acting and saying who you are. I mean, so you know why you're Democrats, you know why you're Republicans, you know why you're Independents, Libertarians, or whatever. It's so hard to be something other than yourself. So it's just so much easier to advocate within the party system that way. But at the same time, you have to be willing, if you're a Democrat or a Republican, to, let's say you're a Democrat like myself, you have to be willing to praise a Republican when he does something right, he or she does something right in the Middle East or with the Arab American community, and you have to be willing to criticize members of your own party when they do something wrong or they say something that's inappropriate. I can just speak to an incident that occurred last year during the Dubai ports fiasco, for lack of a better word, where a couple members of the Democratic Party said some things that were very bad. And it doesn't mean that you have to criticize them publicly. Sometimes it does take a public criticism, but you have to be willing at least to say, hey, you know what, comparing us to unsavory, I don't want to point to the exact word, but there were some very bad parallels that were drawn between Arabs and you have to be willing to criticize those who say that. It doesn't mean that you have to do it publicly, and you want to certainly do it politely and respectfully as it demands.
Eddie, I'm sorry to interrupt. One of the questions I have when we get into those discussions is, because you talked about this, Randa, as being an Arab American activist and being a Republican activist in your party. Is there a price to pay when you pick up the phone and say, you can't say that about our community?
Well, I think, and I'll take this and I'll pass it off. I mean, I think, again, it's a function of your relationship with the particular person who might say that. In this instance, I had an opportunity to speak to the senator who made some comments that I really did not agree with, and I just pulled him aside and I said, Senator, I just want you to know I admire you for A, B, C, D, and E. But when you said this, that really hurt me as an Arab American, and I really think you need to be aware of that there are others, not just like myself, who were offended when you made those remarks. And I think it's just a function of what was said. You have to assess, every situation is different, and you have to draw upon your own relationships. But I just think the bottom line is you have to be willing to praise members of the opposite party when they do things that are right and criticize members of your own party when they do something wrong.
We'll come back to you, Randa. Congressman.
Right. I agree with all the comments that have been made. And I would say that the parties should function as cauldrons where ideas get stirred and vigorously churned around so that they each serve as a way of focusing some ideas so that you get to a final point where two opposing positions will come out, and then you hope for a compromise. And I think that's the way the system was intended to work, and I think that's the way you get the best policy.
Completely off topic, and I apologize, but we have to do this. There's a silver Dodge Guard Caravan, Virginia license 3336, and the door is wide open outside in the parking lot. How about that? Okay.
If I can comment on that caravan.
No, David. He's running for Congress. This is so clear. Congratulations, David.
You got a position on everything, don't you?
I'm going to be, equally fair here in terms of when we talk about these points, but I want to get back to this issue of rhetoric, because discussions for Democratic Party activists or Republican Party activists that are Arab American are not often around ideological discussions. They actually are generally on issues that have very little to do sometimes with what's actually happening in terms of advancing policy. So I'm going to start with the Republicans and ask all three of you to comment on it. Watching the Republican debates is excruciatingly painful as an Arab American, as an American Muslim. And I say that primarily, again, not on substance, generally, although I'm a Democrat and sometimes it hurts, but that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about the way in which the comments and the language that's used, Islamofascism in particular. Candidate Giuliani did not only like to say it so often, but then chided the Democrats for not saying it. How are you able to basically approach your party for the very principles that you believe in and challenge them at the same time and hoping, and then on a very pragmatic level, you want people in this room to vote for your guys. How are you able to turn that into the GOTV efforts and the idea of reaching out to candidates?
I think it's incumbent upon all of us to make sure that the debate is not cheapened and the rhetoric is not dumbed down. And leaders take cues from those around them and from activists who are around them. And so I think when the respective leaders hear from members of their party saying, don't say that, that's wrong, and these are the reasons, or, you disappoint me, it gets back to some of the previous comments that were made. I think we can improve the tone and level of debate and ultimately get to good policy.
Randa?
Sure. I think it's no big surprise we're hearing these terms like Islamofascism and jihad being thrown around the Republican Party. The fact of the matter is that Republicans certainly rely upon them being the party that fights terrorism. I think that it was proven in 2004, certainly, that if you had to vote for a Democrat and Republican and your first concern was terrorism, you're going to vote for a Republican because you believe Republicans are going to protect this country against terrorism from a national security perspective. If you start with that as your base, which most in the Republican Party do, you're going to hear some of these terms being bandied about. I was particularly disturbed by Mitt Romney's recent ad called Jihad. And if you haven't seen it, I believe it's on YouTube, maybe on his campaign website. It was playing in Iowa. When it came out, there was nothing more appalling to me. And I felt the need, as an Arab American Republican, to contact one of his top advisors on the campaign and say, I'm appalled by this ad. I cannot believe that somebody who comes from a minority religion himself, being the Mormon religion, would viciously attack a religion like this and misuse a term that Mitt doesn't understand what the term jihad means. It can be a politically loaded term if you want it to, but in the purest sense of the religious term, it means struggle, a personal struggle. And to take that term and twist it and link it to Islamic fundamentalist, terrorist, blah, 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 is really irresponsible for a presidential candidate. I made my views known. I think it hit the campaign like a shock value. Their response back to me was, oh, we're trying to get him to come to this convention in Dearborn, the Arab American Institute, and if he can't come, we're very much hoping that we'll have a surrogate here, and I was hoping to see that, certainly this weekend. But I think it's incumbent upon us, particularly if we're in these positions and have these connections within the highest level of these campaigns, to make our views known on this. And I think that's one case where absolutely it had to be said. And I'm surprised that Mitt, coming from Michigan, coming from this state where his father was an extremely well-respected governor and who had excellent relations with the Arab American community, would come out with something like that.
Thanks, Randa. David, did you want anything?
Sure. Again, the only way to change how our own party is going to respond to Middle East issues, the only way to change our party's view and the way it's thinking is to let them know what our voices are saying, let them know how we feel. In your own family, think about it. You fight with your own family all the time. We're Lebanese. We all have our own opinions. We're all Arab Americans. We have our own opinions, and we get very, very passionate about our issues. But let someone else say something about our family, and then we defend our own family. We don't want someone else from the outside telling us what to do. If you're a Republican Arab American and you're in the party, you can then have a voice with your leaders. And that's why it's, again, important to join a party, whether it's Republican or Democrat. But there's something else that's also very telling about the Democratic debates. Except for Dennis Kucinich and Ron Paul, speaking their views, and I think that everyone believes that they believe what they are saying, whether we agree with them or not on any issues. It's telling that the leading Democrat candidates don't defend or don't answer what the Republican candidates are saying about Islamic fascism. They are silent. So the Republicans may be wrong on this issue. Democrats have no opinion at all on the issue. And I think that's just as important to deal with.
Thank you, David. Turning to the Democrats, one of the, you touched on this, Eddie, when you talked about a zero-sum approach to politics. Your point was anti-Arab versus pro-Israeli, but in a very domestic way, that's also a discussion about the importance and prominence of the American Jewish community in the Democratic Party, both as a donor base and as on issue-based issues, from civil rights movement on down. So does the Democratic Party continue to sort of approach this from a zero-sum perspective? What is the dynamic among, because that's one of the things you hear a lot about activism in the Democratic Party wearing an Arab American hat, is the challenge of seeing if they give us this, they take away from that. And if both you and Dennis can kind of touch on that. Dennis?
Oh, go ahead. Well, I don't think it needs to be, first off, a zero-sum gain. But, if we as Democrats, as we as Arab Americans want to get our voice out, I think it again comes to being involved and being active. Because who are our elected officials, who are our party leaders going to listen to? They're going to listen to the people they know, to the people that participate within the party. I mean, if we're at the Michigan Democratic Party convention, let's say, and there's 3 people in the Arab American caucus, we're not going to look very influential or very powerful now, are we? But if we are active, if we are involved, let's face it, if we're donating money, then we're going to become a lot more influential, and we're going to be a block, a constituency that people are going to want to listen to. And also, if we're involved in our local level, and there's an issue or a problem, hopefully your elected official is going to go to bat for you and for us and for our community. So, I mean, does the Democratic Party take us for granted? I don't think they take us for granted any more or less than any other constituency group. The question is, what are we doing to get our voices out and to become a powerful and influential bloc within the Democratic Party?
Eddie, how does the pro-Israeli Palestinian conflict play out in terms of the Democratic stuff?
Well, the reality is, and it's whether or not you're at an Arab American conference or any ethnocentric conference, the pro-Israel lobby is incredibly, and it's not that just they're incredibly powerful, they're hardworking and they're smart. I mean, it may be a shock to everybody, but AIPAC, God did not create AIPAC on the 8th day. There were a lot of pro-Israel activists who got together and they worked hard. They donated money, they sweat. The members of Congress as a whole, or the government as a whole, does not take pro-Israel positions because they woke up one day and said we're going to be pro-Israel. I mean, they work hard, and I think that is something. And I saw it having worked for a member of leadership. And I went to the AIPAC conferences every year. I got to know their legislative folks. They work. I don't want to keep repeating this, but they work very hard. And I say that to folks in this room or who may be watching, is that we can talk all we want about how another entity is more powerful or more influential than we are, but there's only one way to change that. Is work harder. Get more involved. I learned that lesson myself, is that when I first came to Capitol Hill, I did not come to Capitol Hill because I was interested in Middle Eastern issues. It was other issues that I was more interested in, and I have realized the need that it has to start with me first, that I have to work harder. But I say that to folks who, if you don't have money, then you can volunteer. You can go work as a staffer. You can do things. If you do have money, you don't have to control every dime that you contribute. In other words, if you give $1,000 or $10,000, that all of a sudden doesn't make you the boss over how that $10,000 gets spent. I mean, that's something that you just have to realize. I mean, the pro-Israel community has that down to a science. There is just X number of dollars that they budget, whether it's a family or an individual, and they stick to it. They may have disagreements on every domestic issue under the sun, just like any other organization. You have pro-abortion Jews, you have pro-life Jews, you have big government Jews, you have small government Jews, you have the Jewish community is just the same as any other community. They have different political viewpoints. But the one thing that they are united on is they believe in a strong, safe, democratic Israel. And whether we agree with what their version of that belief is, the fact of the matter is they believe it and they work hard to implement that within the U.S. government. So as strong as that community is, my answer to that is that we just have to work just as hard, and we have to learn from their successes, hopefully not repeat some of the mistakes that I think they make, and certainly not get engaged in anything that distracts from whatever the particular issue is. And again, it goes back to the first thing that I said, is that you can still be pro-Israel without being you don't have to be anti-Arab to be pro-Israel. You can be both. I mean, Rebecca Bouchadid, who works for the Arab American Institute, one of the things she constantly tells me is that President Clinton left office with both Arab communities and the Jewish community saying he was the best president ever for them. That's the difference between a president getting engaged and a president not being engaged. And so, but it's incumbent upon us as a community to work hard so that we're not always asking, why is someone else doing this better than we are? They have an advantage, they've been doing it longer, but it doesn't mean that we can't work harder too.
Let's go ahead and open this up to questions from the audience. We've got one over here. Let's wait for your microphone, sir, go ahead.
Yeah, you just mentioned about Clinton. What did he do to the Arab? Like, I mean, you said like he's a pro-Israel, pro-Jew and pro-Arab. He pardoned the worst Jewish guy in the world. He pardoned him. I mean, and then you sometimes, you know, we get misled. Second things, you like, nobody, like, you said, Dave, you said we need to be heard. We have to, we cannot be heard without you. So we need you guys to just stand up. The politicians, they are scared. They cannot say anything. Nobody can say anything against Israel. Israel is a terrorist state. They bomb Lebanon. They bomb the Palestinians.
I'm going to interrupt only because you remind me of the point I should have made before we opened it up for questions, which is we really do want to have a discussion. So if you've got a question for the audience, that's great, but let's keep the statements. Do you have a question, though, for anyone? Only because we just want to be able to have the discussion. You've given them, actually, let's do this. You've given them enough to comment on. Why don't we go first to you, Eddie, in terms of his first point, and then I think
the
Dennis
only thing I would
come
comment
in.
about President Clinton is I was just citing poll numbers, and I don't have the exact poll numbers, but it's the polling that's been done in both either the pro-Israel community or the Jewish American community, the Arab American community, is that poll numbers have consistently stated that both communities believe that President Clinton was the best for their respective side. That's what I was pointing to with respect to that.
Did you want to add anything, Dan?
Yeah, I'd like to add to your comment saying that, you know, you need us to stand up to speak for our community, and we need you guys to stand up for our community, because it's not. Look at the powerful interest groups in this country, and whoever you want to look at, whether it's unions or Christian conservatives or whatever group you want to name, it's not because they have one or two powerful people influencing their policy. It's because they have thousands, tens of thousands of people, maybe hundreds of thousands of people behind them who volunteer, who get involved, who donate money. And that's why they're powerful, and that's why they're influential. It's not because they have one person standing behind them. It's because they have an army of people, an army of activists standing behind them and being involved, and willing to call out their legislators when there's mistakes being made, mistakes or disagreements on their policies being involved. So don't look to one person to get it done. We're looking to everybody in this room to help get it done.
Okay. We've got a question here from the front row.
Thank you. My name is Nouman Abu Isa, and the Middle East issues are becoming major issues for the American public. How can we play a leadership role for the American public in this area where we understand more than the rest of the Americans what's going on in the Middle East?
Thank you.
Yeah, I'll take this one because it's an issue that I strongly believe in. I've written op-eds for the Wall Street Journal about if, the most important issue today really is the Middle East and the Islamic world from a perspective of terrorism, translation, intelligence gathering, and public diplomacy. Hands down, it's the most important issue. And who knows this issue better than we, the Arab and Muslim American community? We can be helpful, and it's a point that I've been pushing since September 11th. Unfortunately, the U.S. government is not taking much of this advice in all aspects of it. Some are starting to move in that direction, where they're starting to believe that the place where the experts really are within our community, and we're the ones that can best advise them of the people, the culture, the language, and the politics of the region. I mean, I'm truly convinced that had this administration spent some time in Michigan, in the heart of the Arab American community, where different religious sects and different individuals from different countries all over the Middle East are all congregating in one general area, that we may have been able to give them a better lesson on the Middle East than they ever would have had. And so I guess the answer to your question is we need to continue to push this issue. It is our community that are the experts. It is us that know the region the better, and that the U.S. government should start utilizing us in all sorts of activities to reach out to the Arab world and to maybe solve some of these problems, whether they're in the Middle East or Iran or other places in the Arab or Islamic world.
I agree completely with what Randa just said, and as a member of Congress, it is the most important issue that I'm dealing with, and I'm committed to doing everything I can to work on these issues. The Arab American community is essential, and it absolutely has to be involved in this process. I do agree that the administration has locked out the Arab American community to a large degree. That has to change. I see my position in Congress as a bridge. I'm one of 4 Arab Americans in the House. We have 1 in the U.S. Senate. And we're all working very hard to change the way this administration works on these issues, to inform our colleagues in the House and Senate on the issues, to give them a broader perspective. And this is part of the journey I talked about earlier in my opening comments that I take very seriously. That's why I'm here today, to listen, to meet with many of you, to understand, to get to know you better, and to really know what this community knows and understands about all these issues, whether you're talking about the Palestinian issue, Lebanon, Iran, Iraq. It's critical. It's the most important issue, and I'm committed to it. And I pledge that hard work to you today. Thank you.
Thank you. We've got another question in the back there, please.
I have one comment about the Mitt Romney comment on the jihad and a question.
Let's make them quick.
Okay. The comment is, for you to call is probably one of the least things that benefits we as a group of voters. We need to know how they feel. He obviously knew what the word jihad meant. I can't believe that they didn't, not after everything that's gone on. And by you approaching him, even having to tell him, was not acceptable. They should have known. They should never have used this. To me, that speaks volumes. Now, my question is, as Arab Americans in this country, our position is, what our position in the United States as American citizens is the same interests of the Arab people. When we as Americans go to war with Arabs, Americans and Arabs die. Both die. So none of that is going to benefit neither this country nor the Arab countries. Our lack of continuity is what is here. You have a very large community that is very disappointed with the voting of both parties because they say one thing and they're voting in a different way. And I would highly recommend to all peoples to look at the voting records of all of the candidates, because I think that's where it speaks volumes. 32 votes in the first 6 months on the Hill, and I'll end it with this. 32 votes on Iraq. Nothing changed in Iraq. Guantanamo Bay, illegal. Guantanamo Bay still exists. Nothing has changed. So if our votes don't matter, we have a serious problem, and it's a lot more serious than which party you're going to go invest in.
Okay. I'm going to just take the liberty as a moderator here to please ask, let's go back there. For these to be questions as opposed to comments, we need to do it quickly, please.
I want to direct this to all the panelists, but especially to Ed. because I think the message of you don't have to be anti-Arab to be pro-Israel is a great message to bring everywhere, not just in this community, but outside also. But in order to make this message more credible and for people to really follow through with it, is it possible that we can explain or ask that this support for Israel is never unconditional and never blind?
Thank you.
It's actually a very good point. There were a couple times during the, however we're going to phrase it, I don't want to offend anybody by the way I phrase it, the Lebanon-Israel-Hezbollah conflict last year. There were some resolutions that were headed for the Senate floor and the House floor that were expressing, for lack of a better word, unconditional support for what Israel was doing. And a lot of these things actually don't come out. And I guess it goes to the point that the previous comment was. I just remember Senator John Warner of Virginia, who I may not agree with on a variety of domestic issues. He was the one who stood up and said, because it was a defense authorization bill, I believe, that this resolution was being attached to or in conjunction with. And he said, our support for any other country shouldn't be unconditional. So it is a very valid point. I think it also goes to what Maya was talking about a little bit earlier in terms of how much repercussions there are if you do criticize Israel. And this is where I think, in my opinion, it's the biggest disservice that AIPAC does. You have more internal discussions in Israel about whether Israeli policies are good or bad for Israel than you do in the United States. And so I think what the history of our country has shown is whether it's the majority, whoever is the power, it's incumbent upon that community to make steps to change. And I think we will see the steps that are positive for our community when the majority of Jewish Americans or pro-Israel Americans believe that it's the right thing to do. You saw the same thing with the civil rights struggles in this country. While certainly it was the sacrifices and the blood and the sweat and tears of African Americans over the course of many decades, it was really when you had a tipping balance or critical mass of white Americans who finally said, enough is enough, this is wrong and it's got to change. And I think you're going to see that in the Jewish community. You do see that in the Jewish community already. But the point is taken is that our members, our elected officials, can't be unconditionally supporting anybody because they're doing a disservice when they do that. Disservice to us, but disservice to the government as a whole.
Thank you, Eddie, very much. I'd actually like to thank all of the panelists and apologize to those of you in the audience and that we do have to cut our discussion at this point because we ran over a bit earlier in the other one. Thank you very much for joining us. Thank you to Eddie, David, Dennis, Randa, and Congressman Boustany. Thanks.
Next, C-SPAN's Presidential Library series presents a special program of film clips and interviews not yet seen in the series. Then another chance